Hello everyone and welcome to round number 2 of the Tata Steel Chess Tournament in Wijk aan Zee, the Netherlands. In this video we will have a look at the game between world champion Magnus Carlsen and local hero Anish Giri. So Magnus, he came off the world championship match against Jan Nepomniachtchi not too long ago, and in this game he played pawn to d4, Anish played knight f6, c4 and e6. So using the same opening as Jan chose in the world championship match, Magnus went knight f3, d5, g3, and we have a Catalan. So just like Jan, Anish plays bishop e7. I guess really because Jan had been pretty convincing in the match with the black pieces. So Anish was like, hey, let me try that against you myself, Magnus. So Magnus played bishop to g2, Anish castled, castles, pawn takes c4. And here there's a lot of options. In the match, Magnus chose the move queen c2 specifically against Jan, and Jan would respond with pawn to b5. But Magnus has other ideas. In this game, Magnus goes for the move knight a3, a bit of a weird move, because black indeed can take this knight, and white recaptures. And you might be thinking, like, what is the idea of this opening? Black is still up a pawn, and white has doubled his pawns voluntarily. The thing that white has going here is the fact that he has two bishops, and especially now he can try to take control of the dark squares. But Anish goes bishop d7, a very basic idea in the Catalan. He wants to go bishop c6, and neutralize his bishop on the long diagonal. So Magnus goes a4 to be able to go bishop a3 and hit the rook on f8. So Anish goes rook e8 of course, and Magnus goes queen to c2, going after the pawn on c4. But Anish goes knight b to d7. And things are not so easy, because if Magnus will take the pawn here, there is knight to b6, hitting your queen and hitting the pawn on a4, and black should be quite comfortable here. So instead of that, Magnus goes rook ac1 first, improving the position before he decides to take this pawn. Now it's not so easy for Anish. If Anish goes knight to b6 to defend the pawn, Magnus goes a5, hitting the knight. And the knight will have to move, and then he takes on c4. So both sides are sort of playing a little bit of a waiting game here, which is why Anish plays a6. And now Magnus decides to take on c4. He takes a pawn. But here, of course, Anish goes knight to b6. Hitting the queen and hitting the pawn on a4. Magnus goes queen to c3. So if Anish decides to take with the bishop, now he can take the pawn on c7 with a fine position. So instead of that, Anish takes on a4 with the knight, hitting the queen, and Magnus goes queen to b3. And here, as I was doing commentary today with Hikaru, we both expected the move knight to b6. I mean, black is up a pawn and things look quite comfortable for him. He could go bishop d5, or queen d5 later, and black should be quite fine. But instead of that, Anish played queen d5 right away. Okay, but here the complications start. So Magnus played rook takes c6, a fascinating move. Now here Anish has some options, but it's not easy for black. If black takes on b3, then Magnus is going to recapture, and the problem for black is that as soon as he takes the rook, white's going to take the knight here, and white has a material advantage. White has the two bishops. Now black has a rook and a pawn, but look at these pawns over here, and generally two minor pieces are better than a rook, so white has a winning advantage here. And then the problem for black is you cannot take the rook right away, because that leaves your knight hanging. So that only leaves one move for Anish. He has to take the rook with the queen. Now Magnus went knight to e5, attacking the queen with the knight and his bishop. So in this position, Anish has to keep defending the knight on a4. So that's why he played queen to b5. And Magnus is of course not interested in a queen trade, because then he will be down in exchange and a pawn for nothing. So instead he goes queen to c2. Now Anish is up a pawn and an exchange, but Magnus has some pressure here. He wants to go rook b1, hit the queen, and really he wants to dislodge the queen from the defense of the knight on a4. So the move Anish should have played here is the move knight to b6, saving this knight. Now this does hang the pawn on b7, but if white takes his pawn here, black suddenly has a very nice tactic. Black has the move knight to c4. Okay, so if white takes the knight, black takes the bishop on b7, and black's up in exchange. Black is doing great here. And then the problem for white is white can take the rook on a8, but now suddenly black is going to take this bishop on a3, hit the queen. White has moves like queen to c6, saving the queen and the bishop. Now if black would trade, this would lead to a good endgame for white. But instead of that, black can take the pawn on e2. a2 is also dropping, and the position should be approximately even. I mean, white's losing a lot of pawns, but he has some activity here. White can play bishop e7, for example, saving the bishop, and after black takes here, can take on c7, hitting the pawn on f7, and the game should be approximately even. So this would have been Anish's best option. He could have played a move like rook eb8, which looks good, protecting the pawn, and after rook b1, he can go queen e8. Right, he's still defending the knight on a4, but here white's going to go bishop takes b7, hitting the rook. There's always tactics with bishop c6, hitting the queen and the knight on a4, so that's also kind of dicey for black. But once again, knight b6 really was the move for Anish. Instead, he goes knight to d5, but here he finds himself in a world of trouble. So Magnus goes rook b1, and I'm sure Anish had seen that move. He goes queen a5, he has to keep protecting the knight on a4, but I think here's really the move that he missed, which is bishop takes d5. And now Anish is in trouble. If he takes with the queen, Magnus is going to take the knight on a4. And once again, we know that two minor pieces are generally better than a rook. Now it's not over just yet, but things are difficult for black. If black takes a pawn on a2, white's going to take on b7, and white should be a lot better because of the active rook. Alright, and if black goes f6, we go something like knight d3, and next up we're going to take this pawn in case the queen moves. So white has a nice advantage here. So then what can Anish do? Right, he does not want to hang this knight, so instead of that he took with the pawn. And maybe this is actually where he made an error in his calculation. Maybe he had looked at the move bishop to b4, hitting the queen. This looks like a good move for white, because the queen has to keep defending the knight, right? So the only square you think is queen to b5 to keep protecting that. But here white has to move bishop e1. And the queen actually is trapped, because this knight is taking away these two squares. The rook is attacking the queen, and the bishop is covering the a5 square. So the move Anish must have planned in advance is the move queen to b6. Now you are hanging the knight on a4, but guess what? If you take the knight on a4, there's a5. You attack the bishop cannot move, because if the bishop moves, you hang your rook on b1. So here black is winning, because you're going to win the bishop, you will be up in exchange. But I guess it's really this move from Magnus here that he missed, which is rook takes b7, and suddenly Anish is in a world of trouble. This rook is activated with devastating attack, and what are you going to do about this knight? Alright, if you go knight to b6 saving it, white has queen takes c7, and white is threatening to take here with a checkmating attack, and there's really nothing you can do about it. Furthermore, this knight is going to drop off, so black is just lost. Then if you go knight c3 saving the knight this way, white has bishop e4, hitting the queen and the knight, and once again white is winning and like simply losing the game. You can go queen e1 check, but that's also not going to help you. I go king g2, and this knight is still lost. If you go knight to c3, there's bishop e4, and now you lose the knight due to a pin. If you take on e2, I take on c3, once again with a material advantage. The two minor pieces are stronger than the rook, and also white is very, very active. So here Anish was shaking his head. He knew he was lost. So instead of that, he played the move c5. So he's stopping bishop e4, but now Magnus played a very strong move. And this is quite instructive. This is I see a lot of players making this mistake. You always need to have full board vision. And Magnus goes queen to f5. He's going for an attack on the king side. Anish going rook to f8, defending that pawn, and Magnus takes on f7. Now notice that Magnus is down material, but it's only an exchange. If he gets two moves, he is going to go queen takes, let me just illustrate. If black plays a move like knight to c3, there's always ideas like queen to e6, creating this nasty battery. And the threat is really that if black takes this bishop on a3, you might want to pause your video here, because white has an awesome win. White has knight h6 check, king h8, and queen g8. One of the most beautiful motifs in chess. Black is forced to take the queen, and now knight f7, smothered checkmate. So that is really what Magnus is looking at in this position. So instead of that, Anish goes queen to d8. Bring the queen back to the defense. He is not dropping his queen, because if white takes, black takes on f5, and black is very much in the game. And the idea is that, okay, he's defending the pawn on d5, and if white goes queen e6, he still has queen f6 to defend. Right, if white goes for the same idea now, it doesn't work because the queen is covering this square. Now black is winning. So instead of that, Magnus just goes d takes c5, taking a pawn. He's ready to go c6, hit the rook on f8. Anish goes queen f6, trading the queens, but Magnus just trades. Goes knight h6 check, and c6, hitting the rook on f8. Anish saves the rook with rook after c8, but Magnus just goes c7. And the problem for Anish is that he's ready to go knight f7 check, and then knight d6. Pressure the rook to support his pawn on c7. So Anish is in a lot of trouble. He goes, He goes knight to c3, but Magnus just goes bishop e2, hitting the knight. Now if you take the pawn on e2, white is just going to go king f1, the knight is under attack. And if the knight moves, it actually cannot move anywhere. But even if it could, this would be checkmate. So yeah, Anish is in a lot of trouble. He goes pawn on d4. Now Magnus just played knight f7 check, king g7, and knight d6. Once again, you're gonna lose material here. You cannot move the rook because then c8 will come. So Anish just played king to g6. King f1 by Magnus. He knows he's not in a hurry because this rook is not going anywhere. Anish went knight to b5, but Magnus just took. Rook takes in a4, and this is just completely lost for Anish. If he takes the rook on c7, Magnus is just going to trade and take on d4, and he's up 2 pawns. He has 4 pawns. He has 5 pawns against Anish's 3s, so this would have been an easy win for Magnus. Instead of that, Anish takes with the knight. Magnus takes a pawn on d4, and after knight e6, bishop e3. Anish realizes that this is completely lost. Magnus is ready to go rook b6, hitting the knight on e6 and hitting the pawn on a6. So Anish threw in the title. A very, very tough loss for Anish and all the Dutch fans. And Magnus gets his first win of the tournament. He is among the leaders with 1.5 out of 2. So yeah, definitely the win that Magnus needs in this tournament. It's a long tournament, but it's definitely nice to start off on a high note. So we're going to see whether he will be able to keep that up in future rounds. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next one.